So I wanted to talk about some research that I've been doing over the last 6 years. It's not published yet, so I'd appreciate slight discretion in actually posting my slides. If that's appreciated, it's going to be published soon, I hope. I wanted to focus specifically on one aspect of a very big, very extensive research project, and that was looking at new graduate mental health, and I hope you'll see later on why I've decided to talk about that. So the project that I've just finished I called it the Veterinary Transition Study. So I decided to look at people, following them from their final year in vet school out through their first few years in practice. And the reason this study is quite unusual is because it's a cohort study. It followed the same people over a period of time. And I would love, actually, to be able to pick up with them again in the future. I wanted to start by thanking my participants. I think anyone who was here yesterday will have heard about concerns about stigma from students about talking about mental health. And I was overwhelmed in this study by the honesty and the openness and the enthusiasm and commitment to staying in a lengthy study that we found from my participants, which you'll see when you see the numbers. So I wanted to start by thanking them. I also wanted to start with a quote from one of the participants who is describing their first day in a veterinary job. So this is their first day out of university. And they were describing going out to a farm animal call, leading on from our previous talk, and a conversation that they had with their boss. So they'd been presented the car keys, they'd been presented a vehicle, and they said, the first call I went out to, and I was like, am I going myself? And he was like, yes, we pay you now. You're doing just the same job as everybody else. So I think we talk a lot in the profession about ensuring supported transitions, but one of the themes that came through incredibly strongly in this study, this is not an isolated experience, is that support is not always as we describe or as we hope for. So I think it's important that we can talk about that and understand the reasons why. So in this session, I'm going to talk about why did I do it, what did I do, what did I find, and where do I think we can go from here? I've got a long list of recommendations for all different kinds of areas, but I've decided to focus on the ones today for vets, employers, and for universities. So why did I do it? Fortunately, this study has been an immense privilege to take part in, so this isn't quite as philosophical question as it might read. I'm really glad that we did this study, and I'm very grateful to the people who took part. But I thought I would mention a little bit about why the work is needed. We talk about suicide, and it's really important that we do, but I think we're all very aware that there's a lot more to veterinary mental health and well-being than suicide, and it's important that we understand and address those issues too. So this study looked both at people with experience of suicidal thoughts and behaviour, and also people who hadn't had those experiences but had other issues with their mental health. I think we're all aware that there's concern at the moment about attrition, so people leaving the veterinary profession or leaving veterinary clinical work particularly. And this study is very interested in that, and this study, because it took place over time, it started to access some of the reasons why that happened for individuals, and not just the reason they gave at the point that they left, but also what had built up to that. So what happened for people who may have seemed like they were very, very keen to stay within practice, and then that decision changed for them relatively swiftly. So why did I look at transition? There's several types of evidence that point towards transition to practice being a really difficult time in veterinary careers. I'm not going to go into it because I know that you're all very familiar with the evidence on veterinary mental health regarding this, but there's several different types. There's quantitative evidence, there's qualitative evidence, there's evidence from organisations like Vetlife in the third sector that suggests that transition is a difficult time for mental health. So I was interested in understanding that because I think quite often we make assumptions around that. We assume that it's the same people who struggle at university who struggle in their first year in practice. I can tell you now it isn't. And so I think it's important that we actually address some of those assumptions that we're making because they're not all correct. So what did I do? I did quite a big interview study, and to anyone starting out on a qualitative project, I would say don't do what I did, which is try and make it big so that vets who are very familiar with quant research can see the numbers and feel reassured. I would say that if you're going to do as in-depth a study as I did, unless you want to spend a very long time doing it, be reassured that qualitative research can be high quality with smaller numbers than I used. I did almost 100 interviews over 3 years, almost 6,000 minutes of interview transcripts, she says, having typed them. It was a real privilege that so many people stayed within the study. Only one person did not take part in either follow-up interview, which is incredible. And it says something about people's motivations to stay in the study as well. This was something participants experienced as important. So the questions I looked at were around mental health, they were around support, and they were around identity. And I think if I went back to do this study again, I would have done them in the other order, because it turned out that identity, our sense of what it is to be a vet, I think is possibly more important in our mental health than almost anything else. I think it's bigger than stigma, and I will talk later on about why I think it's bigger than stigma from this data. So what did I find? It's the whole six years' work in 10 minutes that I've got left. I've decided to talk about selected findings, so to zoom in on a couple of points out of a huge study, to focus on a few examples so that you do hear from the participants again, because I think that really matters here, and then talk a little bit about some of the broad recommendations from the whole body of work. So if the recommendations don't seem to exactly fit the findings, it's because I'm zooming in on a few things first. So some of the selected findings. Veterinary training and veterinary work has unintended consequences for well-being. It does impact our well-being. I'm sure you're familiar with that. As I've said, I think identity is absolutely fundamental. One of the things that I found with regard to student well-being was you can keep putting in more and more and more support, and the people who need it the most will potentially never access it because it's incompatible with their sense of what it is to be a good vet student or a good vet. So ultimately then I think, do we need to ask a question? Yes, we need all that support and it's great that it's there, and as you know, I'm involved in supporting people. But I think we also need to perhaps ask, how do we present people at the start of their career with alternative, what we might call cultural scripts of what it is to be a vet? How do we present them with alternative ways of being that mean that they don't get stuck in this very toxic identity that we potentially have? Culture is important. Culture is hugely important. I could talk for days about that. You'll be relieved that I'm not going to. But the one I've decided to focus in on just now is veterinary training can be stressful, veterinary work can be stressful, we all know that. But transition is characterized for many people by unmet support needs, and I wanted to focus on a few of those. First, I'm going to speak very briefly about mental health. So mental health did not, as it was expected to, deteriorate during transition. So when people left university, their mental health did not immediately decline. Despite the fact that they were potentially moving continents, they were undergoing a huge life change. Often we associate mental health difficulties with big life changes. It was not the big life changes that actually affected their mental health. It was things that happened within the workplace. So at 18 months to 2 years, when they had been within veterinary workplaces, mental health had deteriorated for a number of participants, and a lot of that was relating to work. In fact, everybody whose mental health was severely bad at any point during the study attributed it either to veterinary study or veterinary work. Yes, some of them had pre-existing conditions, but they all attributed work or study to having made those worse. As I've mentioned already, it was not the same participants who experienced really very, very difficult situations with their mental health during their first 2 years in practice as the ones who'd struggled at vet school. In fact, the ones who'd struggled at vet school had generally been fairly well supported during vet school and had made different decisions about their first job. They'd often moved closer to home, and they had made decisions about accessing support. They'd made decisions about the practices that they were going to work at, so they'd gone to places that they knew. So potentially there's an issue there that actually students who've experienced serious mental health issues during vet school develop a degree of resilience through that and make very good early career decisions potentially. So, two what might seem like paradoxical statements, but hopefully they're not. Aspects of veterinary work, community, culture and identity can be protective for mental health. So this was a big finding. Work can be really good for mental health, and there's some amazing positive stories in this study too, of people who've experienced very severe mental health issues, including suicide attempts during final year, going on to be very happy and thriving in veterinary practice, and that was brilliant to see. However, what was more difficult to see was aspects of veterinary work, community, culture and identity can also act to undermine mental health. And so it was important for me to understand what those were. And one of the many things that I found was to do with something that I've called a responsibility experience mismatch, which is a mismatch between the responsibility new graduate vets were given during transition and their perceived level of competence and confidence. And I'm not pointing at vet schools during this because these were people who had day one competencies, but what was asked of them out in practice was way beyond what we would consider to be day one competencies. So I've got a quote here, and I'm going to read it to you. It was just very stressful because it was soulful charge. The owner, I went there for my working interview. So this is somebody who's at an interview. And she, the only vet present, said it was a 4-hour working interview. And she said, so I'm not going to stick around, just because if I stick around, people tend to come for me to help, as opposed to the working interview process. So they tend to go to the owner for help. So she just left. So this is somebody who's gone to an interview to meet a practice and has been left on their own in the practice to do a client list while the owner of the practice has left the building. That was a fairly extreme example. Most people did not have an interview process like that, but it shows you the kinds of things that do still happen. A much more common example was something like this, and this was not a unique experience. So I'm going to read you this. It's a quote from another. This person is new graduate, and I think they had been qualified for 2 months at the point of this. There was one day when I was the only vet in the practice because everyone else was out on calls, and I'd done, just spays and castrates and easy surgeries. But then there was this, and it's type of eye surgery that we would not consider a day one competence that was in, and I was like, no, I'm not comfortable doing this. And they were like, well, you'll just have to, because there's no one else to do it. They were like, oh, just get on with it. Just make it up as you go along. But I was like, I'm not comfortable doing that, and I couldn't even find a book in the practice that told me how to do it. It was a senior partner. He was like, oh, you'll be fine. It's a piece of... And I was like, I just don't think it is. So this person went on, having spoken to the senior partner on the phone, to attempt to do the surgery, made a mistake, and the outcome was difficult. But it wasn't really a mistake, because this person had asked for support and hadn't had it. And this was not a unique experience at all. So, some fairly striking findings. Where do we go from here? I've got a series of recommendations, all of which have quite a lot of data behind them. And if you want to talk more about the particular data for any particular recommendations, I can talk about it. The first ones are for employers. And you might be unsurprised that my first one is around support, supervision, induction, and early postgraduate career education. I think is absolutely vital if we want to avoid this drop-off, both in mental health and also in attrition from practice. The number of people who left their first job because of lack of support was huge. And that was the most common reason for leaving a first job. As well as this, barriers to accessing support. And this is where identity comes in, because this is not just about providing more and more support. We actually need to make it possible for people to believe that being a good vet means accessing support, because a lot of people do not believe that at the moment. Also, this responsibility experience mismatch, it's still happening. I think a lot of us had kind of hoped that this would be a lot better than it is. I was shocked and at times ashamed hearing about what has happened to some of the new grads in this study. My recommendations for individuals are about being aware of how our culture can have unintended effects for our well-being. Being aware of using peer support networks. So that might not be a formal peer support scheme. It might be your group of people who look after you and who you can trust and have a close, confiding relationship with. Also being aware of our own professional identity, not least how we're role modeling that to other people, but also about being able to ask for help, because we are in this culture that makes that very difficult. For universities, one of the things that was protective for people was contact with non-veterinary students, so having a more balanced kind of social experience with being involved with other students, so universities thinking about how they can facilitate that. I think universities being very clear about the separation of seeking help and pastoral support and academic progress, and where those can be separated. Because when I was doing interviews with students, one of the things that was very clear was a confusion about what would be an academic progress issue and what would be a health issue. And I think that confusion inhibited people from seeking help who needed it. In fact, the 2 people who'd attempted suicide during their final year of veterinary study had not told the university and had no intention of telling the university, because they were worried that it would be in a progress committee. Also, as we were talking about yesterday, integrated pathways with NHS care. And something I think is important, there was this very high status given to surgery, which kept coming up during interviews, and which actually didn't always result in helpful behaviours or career choices for people. So I think perhaps universities exploring how surgery is not the only high status aspect of veterinary work. Universities thinking about their aspect of transition as well, although actually, as I've already said, the majority of what went wrong during transition actually happened after people had left university. The study definitely doesn't support screening of students. As I've said, all kinds of issues with screening, as you'll know. But screening, I think, free evidence from this study suggests that that would select for people who do not disclose things rather than selecting for people who are actually going to struggle in practice. So potentially this would make the issue that I've been trying to talk about a lot worse, because it would select for people who don't talk, and what we need to do is encourage people to talk more. One of the things that students found most disappointing about the preclinical aspect of their course was the lack of contact with animals. And yet that's something that universities are aware that students find disappointing, but actually it was something that impacted on their mental health as well. And so I wonder if there's scope for universities thinking in a creative way about this, perhaps shadowing clients and their animals through journeys, through hospitals, those kinds of things. Personal relationships with course tutors were absolutely key, and in a few cases were life-saving for final years, and that was how they described them. So making sure that those people who are course tutors, who are giving that support, are given sufficiently high status and reward within university environments too. This is hard work, and it's important that they're rewarded for that and encouraged to stay in those positions. Another thing that was important was that informal support was very strongly favoured over formal support by final year students. Final year students were fully aware the counselling service was there, and they did not want to use it for various reasons. A lot of them didn't. And so I think perhaps universities understanding what's stopping people from accessing those informal supports, because there were structural things stopping them. For example, the timing of resets meant that students who resat every single year at vet school would often not be able to travel home at all during holidays, those kinds of things. So perhaps thinking creatively about things that are blocking informal supports too. So in conclusion, a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the last 6 years of work. I've decided to focus on 3 areas in my conclusions, which are the same 3 areas as my research questions. In terms of mental health, one thing that I decided to pick out to say to you was that it can deteriorate during the first few years in practice, but when support is right, veterinary work can be good for mental health, and it can be protective. And even people who have struggled to an extreme degree during university can go on to do very well in veterinary practice. Support in the first job is incredibly important. Lack of support was the most common factor for people leaving their first job, but it was also a very common factor in people making decisions about leaving the profession completely, and in other aspects of mental health too. And finally, a point I mentioned a couple of times, identity really, really matters. I cannot emphasize this enough in terms of how important it was in the study. I think it's potentially more important than stigma, because actually awareness and stigma, I think, certainly my perception, having worked with students for 10 years and having gone through all of the data in this study, is that there is a generational shift in mental health awareness and in stigma and in being prepared to talk about things, but there isn't necessarily a shift in the way that we are behaving as a profession in terms of accessing support in crisis. Yet people will call Helpline, but then whether they'll go on to access workplace supports and stuff is sometimes a different issue. So my idea here is I think we need to provide alternative ways of being a vet, so alternative cultural scripts. What kinds of ways can we suggest to people that, yeah, this is a way to be a vet, this is a way to succeed in your career, and yes, part of that is being able to access and ask for help, because if we don't do that, I think we could continue putting more and more and more support in place, and some people will never, ever be able to use it. So thank you.